Okay, very good. So we're now recording. I just want to make sure that we were doing that before we get started. Um, so thank you, those of you who have joined us this evening. Quickly, I'll just introduce myself really briefly. I'm the Curriculum and Online Training Director for Casio America, Nathan Austin. I spent a variety of time teaching at the high school level, a little bit at the college level, doing some software development for Casio. And now I'm happy to be in a role where I can work with our teaching training, our online training, our curriculum, and so forth. And at this time, I want to introduce our speaker for this evening, our presenter, John Deal. He has been teaching for 33 years. I don't need to read all of this to you. You could read that on your own. But he's got a lot of experience in the classroom, including some statistics there. It says here, AP statistics exam reader for 12 years and so forth. And I enjoy chatting with him because I pick up new things from him from time to time, so it's kind of nice. I'm looking forward to enjoying his presentation along with you all. Before I hand over to him the reins, so to speak, I just want to reiterate, as we mentioned earlier, that for the sake of audio quality, everyone's going to be muted. If you have a question, feel free to type it in the question pane, and I will be the one responding back to you privately. Unless we think it's a question that maybe will benefit the group or it's a larger question, then I'll share it with John and he'll address it. You can always raise your hand. There's a little hand symbol on the interface that you can do, or if you type a question in, I'll see that, and again, I'll respond. So with that, I will pass this over to John. And there you go, sir.
Very good. Thank you, Nathan. Good evening, everybody. Very nice to have you with us this evening. I do apologize. I got a bit of a gravelly voice as I'm just getting over some kind of cold symptom that I'm not sure what it was. So apologize for that. Before we jump into, we recently sent you via email a handout that goes along with this webinar. I have that on the screen here at the moment. So if you already have that, or if it's very convenient to quickly retrieve that from your email, but really that's not necessary. We'll go at a pace where if you are interested in typing along, either on an emulator or on a handheld Prism, we will go at a pace to allow you to do that. But even if it's just for future reference, perhaps sometime later on after the webinar is over and you want to kind of recreate what we have done, we have sent this handout to you via email. All right, next I am going to open up what we call the emulator or the Manager Plus software. So I have on the screen here a working version of our Casio Prism. You can also see a second window that we call the key log, which will keep a record of what keys hit. Because I suspect some persons in our audience might be new to a Prism, I'm going to just make a few preliminary comments about navigation via the keyboard, and then we'll go back to our statistics example and go through some of the details about linear regression. Just as a point of information, next week we'll do a part 2 when we'll talk about a regression problem that involves some transformation and some data that looks like it has noticeable curvature as opposed to being roughly linear. So, but for part 1 tonight, we'll focus really on linear regression. So, may I highlight the most important keys as we work on our Prism. Right here, you see where the red spotlight is the menu key. And the menu key is one we use each time we want to start in a new place, such as graphing menu, statistics menu, equation solver menu, or any of those. That will bring up the screen that you see right now, this icon-based menu selector. All right. Directly below that is the exit key. Think of exit as going back one screen. On the very top, we see some round keys, F1, F2, etc. Sometimes we refer to those as soft keys because they take on many different roles. When we do some work this evening, you will see what we're going to call tabs directly above those keys. And so whatever you see directly above F1. This will all make better sense as we actually travel through our example and work. But I just want to have a little bit of common vocabulary when we say press the F1 key. That will be up here on the top. This is our cursor wheel. So if we say go right or go left or go up or go down, down here in the corner, you'll see our execute key. It actually does not say enter. It says EXE for execute. And that will be the way to finish a command. Some of us were thinking that the center of the wheel would serve as execute. And in fact, that's a change we've requested from R&D. But quite frankly, right now, that is not the case. So this execute key will be a very important one for us. And at the risk of stating the somewhat obvious, but here we have the shift in basically a yellow tint, and of course that will mean to use the yellow command. So when I talk about setup, it's actually to go shift and then the menu key because the yellow words there are setup. We won't use it very much this evening, but in a similar nature, the red alpha key, we would press alpha and then the corresponding key to get ABC, and so on. We'll talk certainly about other things, but that was a brief help, I hope, of the soft keys, the menu, the exit, the cursor wheel itself, and the execute. Please, if we're having any questions about navigation, do type that in your chat box and we will help you out with that right away. All right, I'm going to go back for a moment then to bring back this handout just to set the context. This is a problem from a textbook from a good friend of mine, Dave Bach, as well as his co-authors, Paul Velleman, Dick DeVoe. And one of the things I appreciate about statistics is that problems are realistic. They come in context. This one was cited from the Ithaca Journal. And what we really have are some used Toyota Corolla cars. Some of you who teach AP statistics might even remember that as a popular type of question. On the very first AP exam ever, back in 1997, we had a similar scenario, age of cars, prices. So here we have in table form the age of these cars in years and the price that the car was. I guess it was the asking price that someone was selling that car for in the classified ads in that newspaper. So our intent tonight is to enter these data into two lists, age in one list, price in another, and do some of the typical type analysis of bivariate data, including scatter plots, linear regression, and so on. So again, we did email this to you, but I will talk you through entering the data if you haven't had a chance to get that yet. So I am back to my Prism. If you are not already there, again, please in row 2, I've got the arrow here. We're going to start pushing the menu key. Let me do that again. So when you push the menu key, it should bring up a screen that looks like this. There are different choices. We're going to work in statistics, of course. But just for the record, there are actually two ways to make this happen. Notice if I use the cursor, I move around to the various icons and they are highlighted. So you can highlight the icon you want and then press, remember, execute. However, in my opinion, each of these icons has a small character, and I do say a character because after 9 it starts with ABC, and that's the faster way to go. So honestly, my suggestion if we were trying to start would simply be push the 2 to open up the statistics menu. And that should bring up a list editor where we are going to enter our data. Now in this case, it's important to realize that sometimes you may have some lists here and you would like to erase those lists. And this is a little deceptive, I have to be honest, because I was already here. I suspect your screen, if you just went here, looks like this, where, again, the tabs have these particular choices. I want to bring attention to a symbol right here. This little triangle symbol is really a symbol that says there are more choices to do. I have more than 6 things that you might do while you're in this list editor. And so that little symbol is really suggesting to you, oh, you can see more choices. And so you would literally push F6, and notice all those tabs have changed now. F1 now says Tool, and so on. So the way to erase all of the values in a list is this choice, F4, that says Delete All. That does not delete all lists. It actually deletes all of the entries in the particular list that is highlighted. If you used F3 delete, that would just take out a single value. So I actually am going to push F4. There's a little safety check here. Are you sure you really wanted to delete this entire list? In this case, my choice is yes, I do. So we push F1, and that would be the way to go if you have old data that you are going to remove. So we are going to put the 15 values in list 1 for the age of these cars. For example, the first car is age 1. I literally press the 1 key. I press execute. The cursor moves down automatically. I am going to clean off some of these. Here we have the history of what we're pushing. This just might help as some of them go off the screen if you need a quick look. We have another 1. We have 3. We have 4. We have 4. We have 2 5s. We have 1 car that is 6 years old. We have 2 cars that are 7 years old. We have 2 cars that are 8 years old. We have 2 cars that are 10 years old. And our last car is 13 years old. Just a little check. Notice on the far left here, there are values that says 13, 14, 15. That actually is telling me what row am I in this list editor. So indeed, we have entered 15 values in list 1. Here's an optional comment, just so you're aware. Up here, you have an option of entering a label for these data if you wish. It's absolutely not necessary, but I could push the red alpha key, A, alpha, G, alpha, E, execute. And then I have a label here so I recall what's being placed in list 1. However, unlike some other model calculators, when we actually do things like set up our plot, set up a least squares regression line, we will not use that label. We'll just call this list 1. So this is simply a label of convenience if you choose to do so. All right, I'm cursoring over to the right, so I can now put values in list 2. We have some prices of 13,000, 990, 13, 495, 12, 999, 9,500, 10,495, 8,995, 9,495, 6,999, 6,950, 7,850, 6,999, 5,995, 4,950, 4,495, and our last car has a price of 2,850. Always a good idea when you're working with paired data to double check. Yes, it looks like I have 15 values in each list, and this last pair of age 13, price 2,850 is lined up correct, so we shouldn't have any dimension problems. For those of you that are glancing at the handout, we have finished the two items on the first page. I'm going to pause for a moment so that people who are typing along have had a chance to finish completing their lists, and give you a moment if you want to pose a question or a comment. And so again, I'm just going to hold on just a moment. Please type in a question or a comment if there's any way to help you so far.
Well,
anything you have so far, Nathan, that has been already asked?
No, we're looking really good so far.
All right, very good. Just for a little bit of appearance on the screen, I'm going to then erase what we've had in our key history so far. And again, just as a side remark while I'm doing that, I do find this emulator as a very nice way for classroom instruction, especially early in the year. The fact that that key history can be displayed right up there on the screen, so students can have a visual reminder of what keys were pressed. All right, now if you're not on page 2, great. If you're not there, that's okay, but I just want to use this opportunity to mention a couple things that would affect what happens as we proceed. Excuse me. So one of the options on this calculator is to have an automatic window setting, which I honestly find quite convenient for scatter plots. In other words, we don't have to worry at all about selecting the X-min, the X-max, and so on. Although I know some teachers find value in having students think carefully about these data and what would be an appropriate window. I guess my point is you can have it either way. But it's important to know that you have that choice. And remember earlier when I mentioned the menu key, and then I said above it is a setup? This is one of the choices that appears in setup. So let's go there for a moment and take a look to clarify what I'm talking about. Again, the way to access setup, please, is the shift key. And here's a little help too. Notice in what we call the status bar of our calculator screen, there's actually a yellow S acknowledging that the shift has been pressed. So now I go to Setup, and this very thing on the top is what I was speaking of. StatWind, of course, is abbreviation for the window. But my particular calculator has been set on Auto for an automatic look. If you chose, notice down here again at my soft keys, that F2 says manual. So if I push F2, it changes to manual. Again, that would allow you to go into a viewing window and set it up as you wish. However, if you forget about that, then you may be surprised when you try to create your scatter plot and you don't see the points in your particular viewing window. So quite honestly, most of the time I leave that set on auto. Also, just a little bit down the road, we're going to speak about the residuals of this, and the residuals can be stored in any list that you wish. Again, in other words, please recall, we're not using particular list names here. So often I store mine into list 3, but again, if you're doing transformations or something, you might want to put them over in list 5. It's very easy to designate this. If right now your calculator looks like this and says none, then I would recommend you make this change. See how we have a tab that says list right above F2? So I would literally push F2. It will open up a dialog and says, well, where would you like me to save them? Again, a nice place would be list 3, but you could certainly make another choice. Don't forget on this calculator to acknowledge that it is EXE for execute. Those are the two important features that we would be using right away in terms of looking at the scatter plot, doing the regression, and looking at residuals. Now, what did we do? We went from the list editor to a place that I called the setup. We're now finished with the setup changes. The fastest way to return is literally this key that I mentioned earlier, the exit key. Exit key literally goes back to where we were right before we did this setup thing. So it's really good. It took me a little bit, a day or two, to get the hang of the navigation of the Prism. I find it very friendly once I did, but that's one of the things to learn. Exit, boom, has taken us back to the list editor. Now, remember a little while ago we used that F6 key and we changed that. The purpose of that was to see this delete. I'd like to do that again, F6. There's yet one more choice. F6, we're back to the original choices that appeared when we opened up the list editor. In other words, when we went menu to statistics, this is where we were. So, if we were hoping to make a scatter plot, in other words, a graph of our data, it seems pretty logical, I hope, that we would push F1 for graph. That should change the tabs. Now, it is acceptable right now to actually push one of these 3 keys and get a graph. However, I do have a caution. Your graph that you will see will depend on certain things. So for 2 reasons. 1, because it's the safest thing to do, or number 2, because some of our group may be new to how this works. I recommend for a moment here that we take a trip over to F6. The tab above F6 says Set, and this is the place where you'll make sure that these graphs, graph 1, graph 2, graph 3, are, well, what you had in mind. What are you hoping to create? What do you want to see as you're making your graph? So I'm going to go there to Set, and this is for stat graph number 1, which is great. On my calculator, it happens to be already set up for a scatter plot. so that's just right. But if, for example, the other day you made a pie chart, and so pi appears there, you would change that to using the F1 key to the choice for scatter. In a similar way, list 1 is just right for me, the age of the cars, list 2. But if you need to make a change there, again, use the F1 to get a list dialog box and make a change if needed. So honestly, I almost always have Graph 1 set up in this very way. And so I guess I'm trying to say you don't have to go to this set each time, as long as you know in advance how you've set up choices 1, 2, 3. There are some other cool things here about color and so on that we'll explore at some time, but not right at this moment. So I'm ready to say, okay, I'm happy with my setup. Don't forget, it's exit to come back to the editor. Let me try and summarize, I hope, what we've tried to indicate here. We can press the Graph 1 key, but what happens when you press the Graph 1 key is dependent upon what you have done in the set. So as long as you know that is just what you want, you're ready to press F1 and create your scatter plot. And hopefully that's what we have on the screen. Again, we put in an auto window, and so we should be able to see all 15 of the points automatically in that window. I'll take a moment in case we have to troubleshoot for anybody where yours, because it won't be fun to continue if our scatter plot is not visible there for you. Once again, just type in a note, a question, a comment, if we need any help getting what we have so far. While I'm waiting for that, I will mention that under the viewing window, you do have some control over these scale marks, if you will. In other words, going from -1 to 15, that's a little bit large on the scale. So I'm going to show you what happens here. If I go maybe 3, and here in particular, these are pretty large numbers, 17,000. But what happens if I go maybe 3,000 here? The one little advantage to that is simply that I have nice grid lines on my screen. So wait a minute, how come sometimes you have grid lines and sometimes you don't? Well, it depends on the scale. When I had a scale of just 1, there would be so many grid lines there that the whole thing would just kind of be this solid blue. So the calculator actually sort of has this wise feature in that it will show these grid lines if you have sensible scaling on both axes. And you actually have the ability in setup to just disable them and turn them off completely if you're not interested in those. I just know from the past sometimes there's questions that come up and say, gee, it seems like sometimes I have blue grid lines and sometimes I don't. And what I discovered is it seems to be within the scale. If they're far enough apart that it looks sensible, kind of like a good old graph paper, then that works. Any questions, Nathan?
Not exactly. I missed one earlier from Jeffrey, so I don't know if he wants to try that again. But other than that, we seem to be doing all right.
All right, so I will be happy to field one if that would be helpful.
So I'll just wait a second and see if, like I said, Jeffrey had a question, but it was kind of in context, and because I didn't get the action you had just performed, I wasn't able to figure out what he was looking for.
If you wanna unmute him for a moment and let him ask that directly, that's fine.
That's another option. If you want to talk, Jeffrey, you can do that, or you can just pass to. It's your choice. So he said, no problem. I'm going to assume that
all right.
he'll hold that.
All right, so I hope that means that those that are typing along and working along, have been successful at getting the scatter plot that looks like what we have here on the screen. So one of the important questions we'd be asking in statistics class is, does it appear that a linear model would be sensible for these data? In this case, author Dave and others have picked a pretty realistic problem, but I think a great one to start with, as we would say, well, these aren't perfectly linear. Of course, these are real-world data. But in fact, it looks like a linear model would be most appropriate in this case. So let's go ahead and proceed with that. All right, so folks, we have our tabs. Here's a new one. This one says Calc for calculate, and that's where we are going to discover several important things. So let's all push F1 for the calculate, and this brings up different menus. The first one is two variable statistics, if you will. If we want to look at the mean of variable X, the standard deviation of variable X, the mean of variable Y, etc., that would be the place to go. But these other buttons are, in fact, different types of regression that you might use. And again, this might be slightly unfamiliar symbolism, but three of these are actually polynomial regressions. And for the record, you don't need to do this, but I'll just do a quick demo. We have additional choices. We had logarithmic, exponential, power, sinusoidal, even logistic. So that's what all these stand for. But in this case, if we're wanting to go linear, we're going to make this choice right here, X. I guess what I'm trying to clarify for new users is this literally is, meaning you're going to do a regression with a plain X in it. If you went over here, you would actually be doing a quadratic regression, kind of an AX squared plus BX plus C thing and so on. So that's why this is important to realize. That symbol X really does mean, yes, you're choosing linear regression. Let's all push F2. Oh, here's the age-old dilemma of statisticians tend to use coefficients with A first, or sometimes, like on the AP, we use a B0 and a B1. But I know in algebra class that some people would just as soon not let B be the slope, and that's all these are. It simply is, do you have a choice between which coefficient stands for which? It is not two different lines. It's not two different values for the slope and intercept. It simply is which constant is being called A and which one is being called B. For stat sessions, I actually do have a minor preference for F2, but you know what? Feel free to use F1 if you would rather. Here we go. When we push F2, boom, should bring up our result of linear regression. And again, the good news is up on the top in blue, we see which way did I do it to clarify that coefficient A is the intercept, coefficient B is the slope. We also get R, the correlation coefficient. In this case, we note two things. It's negative, and it's fairly small, and by small I mean moving away from 0. In other words, it's fairly close to -1. So I think an interpretation of this, and I'm going to put my own bias in here, meaning the interpretation of this value, along with the look we had at the scatter plot, says we have a fairly strong, reasonably linear, and negative correlation. In other words, sometimes AP statistics exams say, what is the interpretation of what we have here? And those are the three things I would say, that it is strong, linear in the negative direction. We also have the coefficient of determination, R squared, displayed. and this is MSE, mean squared error. Error meaning literally in this case the residuals. So if we took all our residuals and we squared them and we added that together and divided by, in this case, 15 to get the mean squared error. And that is kind of useful, I think, for comparing models. One piece of advice, when you've done this linear regression, a convenient thing to do is to go here to the F5 and copy it. You don't really have to do that, but it is a great way to get it in the y equals editor in case you're going to be doing some other things with this result. So again, I recommend, and let me clear off this because there's just too much there. So this process will be F5. Now in this case, my y equal editor is clear and clean. And since Y1 is highlighted, I can just push execute. It doesn't really look like much of anything happened, but I promise you that this result has now been stored under Y equal, and I'll show you how to verify that in just a moment. On the other hand, whether you've copied it or not, it doesn't make any difference. F6 draw literally is, let's go back to the plot and superimpose the line, please. So here we go, F6, and there we see now a nice diagram of the scatter plot as well as the regression line superimposed on there. Again, reinforcing, I think, that it's a pretty good model for the data set that we have. I would like you to observe that above F1 in yellow we have trace. If I go Shift F1, I now have a cursor on the screen, kind of looks like a pink cross, and I am now on my regression line. I could also just jump to, let's say, oh, I want to predict what about the age. That's not true. I apologize. I'll explain why in a moment. I do know that if I push the up and down arrow, I move. Notice on the screen it says we're on stat graph 1. That means we're actually on the scatter plot. These are the points corresponding to the original data we put in there. So there, for example, is the 3/12/99. I'm tracing on the points. Down arrow, I've moved to the regression line, and I'm tracing on the line. There's two ways to do that thing I mentioned before about just jumping to a point. One of them is Shift F5, and now you can say, oh, X is 11. Execute. There's another way I'll show you in a moment. But I did want to make it clear you can, once you have created this plot, you can trace both on the scatter plot as well as on the regression line. Let me try something here a little bit. I'm going to push the exit key and I'm going to recreate that graph. And the reason I did that is, you might recall earlier I talked about the calc key. Next to it is something that says DEFG, apparently define a graph. And I'm going to push F2 so you'll see what I was speaking of. There's more of the proof that the results really were saved there under Y1. And now that I've done that, when I draw, there's some subtle differences. One of them being the line's a little thicker. And now when I push trace like this, again, there's a few subtle differences on what you can do. But I just wanted you to see about that defined graph and verify that it really was saved. So again, though, I just exit out, recreated my graph.
John?
Yes.
We have a quick question. Just wanted to see how you did that Y calculate again.
Okay, good. So What I was doing was, once you're on the screen and the line is visible, the way we get that is here under Graphical Solve. Once you've used Prism a little bit, you'll realize the power of that is the place where you find x-intercepts, the place where you find local max and local min, and lots of those features that you're used to using on a graph menu. In this case, there aren't too many choices for what we're going to do, but what I did a little too quickly, and I apologize, is I went to Shift F5, and then I made this choice Y1 for a Y calculation. In other words, I'm trying to predict a Y. What is Y when X is 11? So that was the secret, and it opens up this question box. What value of X? In my example, if X is 11. Execute. All right, so one more time just to reinforce. So it was Shift F5 because it says Graphical Solve, and then the Y calculate. I want to know a particular value of Y, and just to do a different one, I'll put in 4 years. Execute. Those were the main things, but before we stop, I would like to take about 5 more minutes of your time and just show you one other feature that I think is very important for doing regression and modeling. I kind of hinted at it earlier. If you'll recall, you don't have to go back there, but I am going to remind you that when we went into setup, I made this suggestion that we save our residuals in something, one of the other lists. In this example, I used list 3. Now I am going to exit from setup. In fact, I'm going to tell you a brief shortcut when you're in some of these places. There's a minor difference between exit and quit. Exit goes back one screen. Where were you before you were on this screen? Quit goes back to the very beginning of the menu we're in. In this case, we're doing the statistics menu, and so I will demonstrate what I'm trying to reinforce. If I do Shift Quit, that guarantees me I'm back in the very beginning, which is where I wanted to be. So I'll just reinforce. Exit, back one screen, quit, all the way back to the very beginning. Why did I go here? To try to persuade you that these things we called the residuals really have been saved there into list 3 as suggested. Please remember in the future, they're only there if you designated a list, because one of the options for residuals is none. Not that it would be that terrible. You could simply change that and quickly do the regression again. But it is your choice as to where. And one of the choices is none, nowhere. All right, so how would we make a residual plot? Well, the good news is it's essentially the same thing as something we've already done this evening. The residual plot in terms of this calculator work is nothing other than another scatter plot. Let's review. F1 for graph. I'm going to make a different graph. So I'm going to revisit set once again. So again, that was F1 for graph, F6 for set, and just to reinforce, I'm going to use graph number 2. So I notice the tab above F2 says graph 2. It actually has changed. Graph 2, yes, I still want a scatter plot. Yes, I want x's on the x-axis. And now I want my residuals on the y-axis. So if your calculator does not say list 3 there, that's the change you would make, and just use F1 again to open up the question box for which number list. Also, for convenience, I'm going to go down here we didn't do this before. I just kind of let that first scatter plot we made. It sort of used the default color of blue. You'll see why in a moment, but it makes me happy to make my scatter plot in a different color. So I've moved down, after I did list 3, I moved down a few choices. You could even change the type of marking if you wanted to, but I'm just going to focus on the color. Well, how do I change color? Well, the good news is it seems to have a color tab here at F1. Pick your favorite color other than the blue. I've got red, I've got magenta, I've got green. I think on the handout I used red, so I'll stick to red. Press a 3, we're good. Okay, but wait a minute, we're in this set again. Yes, we are. Press exit to leave. Now, think about what we've done. We've actually set up graph 1 as the original scatter plot. We've set up graph 2 for a residual plot. If I only want one of them, the fast way to do it is to say, well, right now, I want to see graph 2. How do I see graph 2? Simply push F2. And again, because we had the stat window setting to automatic, it has resized the window to be an appropriate choice for the residual plot. Now there's a little something there, you know, if you got real serious about that, you might say, well, I see a little bit where the highest residuals are on the ends and so on. Boy, residual plot analysis can get a little deep. I don't propose to do that tonight, but I don't think there's any totally obvious any obvious pattern that really says there's a much, much better model available. But I always believe the construction and a look at residual plots is very, very useful. Lastly, it doesn't always work. Kind of depends on what data you have and so on. But in this case, I'd like to demonstrate if I push exit and I go back here, what if I'd like to see both things at the same time? By things, I mean the original scatter plot, the regression line, as well as the residual plot. That's actually fairly easy. But can I reinforce, if you push F1, you're going to get graph number 1. If you push F2, you're going to get graph number 2. How do I get them both? The secret is here at F4, where it says select above there. So let's all push F4. And now we see, well, in this case, the last one we did was 2, and that happens to be on. But now I have a choice. How do I toggle? Well, right here. F1 turns on, F2 turns off. And so the difference being when I say on, now notice that stat graph 1 is on, and stat graph 2 is also stayed on. Reinforcement. Don't go here if you only want one graph. But at some point, if you want 2 or even 3 graphs simultaneously, this is the place to go. However, occasionally I make a mistake and I push exit and then I try and graph again. No, you actually have to enable this feature right here, you have to draw right now. So when we push F6 to draw, there we go. We have a nice look at both of those plots. And again, it's kind of used automatic window settings so that they'll all fit and be displayed. And you can see for sure now why I appreciated the idea of going in there with a second color. Also, to review something we did earlier, if I go back to the define the graph to say, oh, please draw the line as well, I can add that to the picture. So there we go. We've got our scatter plot. We've got our least squares regression line to model the data. And we have a residual plot as well. One of the things that I like to reinforce is that these residuals are actually visible then both ways. If I can try and elaborate on what I mean by that is here's a point up here. It's above the line. It should have a positive residual. That same residual is being indicated there. Here's a point that's somewhat noticeably below the line. It should have a negative residual. That same exact distance is here as far as how far is that point below the horizontal axis. So I think this can help students see how information about your residuals is really there twice. Residuals are measured as a distance from the regression line. Also in the residual plot themselves, they are the same measurements as far as distance from the horizontal axis. Both of those, again, in this scale now opened up a little bigger. Again, I'm going to just offer the opinion that I don't see any dramatic curvature there that we would have to take into account. So based on a number of things, being the scatter plot itself, the value of R, which was reasonably close to -1, and the residual plot, all of those lead me to comfortably say that a linear model is a good one for these data, and at least for making predictions within these values or very close to it. We could have another lengthy discussion about the dangers of extrapolation and how we always have to be careful about using a model for something far beyond the 13 years. And that can get pretty interesting for cars, let's face it. Sometimes, you know, this would make this appear that once your car is getting out here at, say, 15 years old, it has very little value. But then all of a sudden, what if your car is now 30 years old and it's an antique? It may have a high value again. So all I'm going to be, I'm just going to stick to, we've done a good job of modeling for the data that we had within that domain. Well, we took almost a full hour there. I hope there were lots of helpful suggestions and that you were able to follow along. We can use about 5 more minutes here for any last comments or questions that you, the group, might have. While we're checking in, if we want to type anything else, again, I thank you very much for joining us on our Casio webinar tonight. And a reminder that we did send you this handout, so you could work through that again. And we'll do another similar type example where we'll go a little bit further with some data that appears to have noticeable curvature next week. If you're not available for that live, you have a couple options, but again, we record these webinars, so you could certainly listen to it at your own convenience. And we'll be happy to share that handout with anyone that requests that as well.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I had neglected to mention the reminder for the webinar next week, so thanks for remembering that.
You bet.
And earlier on, someone said that they had a PDF, that their copy of the PDF was blurred. I tried resending it, but if any of you do have a blurry copy, have some issues with it, we can deal with that even after the webinar is over. Feel free to send me an email at naustin, that's N-A-U-S-T-I-N, at casio.com, and I can make sure you get, we can figure out what's up with that, the handout quality.
Yeah, let us know. The one on my screen, and I'll be honest with you, I printed it out on a printer as well here, so I didn't have too many screens open at once, and it came out fine for me. So something strange happened there in the sending or the opening, and we'll do everything we can to get you a nice clean copy.
I did find that when I printed mine, there are some font issues that happen just because of the keystrokes, but that's kind of a tricky thing for us to overcome. I'm not sure.
That's a good point.
So again, if any of you would like an updated handout, you can send me an email, and I'll be happy to take care of that for you.
Let me see if I can help with that one comment, though. If you opened up a Word file and you did not have the key font, then you would definitely get strange symbolism. In the PDF, it seems to me that shouldn't be an issue.
Right. Well, that's what I was thinking. So I'm not sure. It could just be a weird glitch on my end, too, when I printed it.
Well, we'll double check.
Right, right. So I haven't seen any questions yet, just sort of a last call. And while that's going on, I'm going to show really quickly a website that you can hit if you want to see any further information. We have an online training course that is free. You may or may not know about it. But it'll take you through a quick glance at pretty much all of the main features of the Prism, which may be useful for you. And those who complete it right now, we have a special promotion. We're giving a calculator or a license of our emulator software away to finishers while supplies are lasting. So, it's totally free, totally at your own pace. If you're interested, there's the website for you. All right. Any last questions? Again, if you have any questions or you need that website or anything at all, feel free to contact me at naustin, N-A-U-S-T-I-N, at Casio.com. Oh, I see a hand. Let's see. Here, Todd, I'll just unmute you at this point. What can we do for you?
I was just going to say, I love your guys' calculators, but I was wondering how you're going to break TI's stranglehold on education so I can actually use them in the classroom.
That is the million-dollar question. One way, honestly, in our opinion, is to get them in educators' hands, because that's, in my estimation, the biggest hurdle. Is no one can make an educated decision unless they can see all their options. And right now, I'd say the biggest response, the most common response we get is, "Oh no, thanks, I use TI." So, it's like, I'm glad if you like it better, you use what you like. I just, we want to make sure all the teachers out there know what we've got.
And I would encourage you to be a pioneer and say, I'm going to demonstrate this in my classroom. And I realize, it's easier said than done, but even if you wind up with a mixed group of students, we hope some folks are willing to take that step.
Nice comment from Jeffrey as well. Said it was great, clear, and well-paced. So that's for you, John.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you very much.